قسما بالله رب العالمين وارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء. هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome again to the Finding Me series on the ITV networks. Today I have invited Professor Laurie Nathan again to the studios to discuss with me a very important topic, and that is something which is pertinent, it is relevant, it is current, and it is related to many of us who identify ourselves with the current situation in Syria, especially the conflict, if you look at it, and the manner in which it has escalated, the trauma and the humanitarian crisis that is now unfolding in Aleppo. Professor Laurie Nathan is the chairperson or the director of the Center for Mediation in Africa at the University of Pretoria, and we have had him over in a previous discussion where we spoke about the general aspects of mediation, but today the focus is on Syria and Palestine. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here, Laurie.
Great, that's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for taking on this tremendous challenge of discussing two very, I think, difficult discussions, and that is Syria and Palestine, and the conflict, because these are protracted conflicts, and they, I suppose, have very many contexts and very many issues at play.
And they are both intractable in the sense that there's no obvious solution in sight, and they are deeply catastrophic to the people who are living through these conflicts. And they also have in common that they are at the epicenter of geopolitics, which makes them much more difficult to resolve than local conflicts.
Okay, now, speaking as a mediator, that's already quite depressing because you see this now through your particular lens and you realize that it's perhaps almost impossible to mediate this conflict, or do you believe that there is a potential and a possibility to mediate?
Look, mediators are meant to be optimists.
Okay.
And if they weren't optimists, they wouldn't be doing mediation.
That's true.
But I must say that there are particular problems associated with both. They're different problems,
yes.
Syria and Palestine, that make them particularly hard. But all civil wars, all serious internal conflicts are very difficult by definition to solve when violence has reached this level. So it's one thing to try and prevent them from escalating to the point that they've reached now. But when they've escalated to that point, the level of hatred and enmity where people have died on both sides is so deep that they cannot imagine a solution. And apartheid South Africa was like that too. On the day on which the ANC was unbanned by de Klerk speaking in Parliament, I was at a rally in Cape Town to unban the ANC. We were about to be attacked by the riot squad, and the news came through, de Klerk has unbanned the ANC. And our response is, no, it's impossible. It's impossible.
You couldn't imagine it.
It's impossible. How could you can't imagine. And the Communist Party, it's unimaginable. So you have the problem of imagination, you have the problem of deadly enmity, you have the problem of pain and injustice, and then you have different types of additional problems. In Palestine, you have a real problem with asymmetry. It seems from historical research that conflicts where there is acute asymmetry are harder to solve than those where there's some parity of power. Where you have acute asymmetry, as in the case of Israel and Palestine, with Israel backed by the US, of course, the strong party doesn't feel enough pain. It's not under enough pressure. What's the incentive? It can keep going for a long time. It's not going to lose. It doesn't think it can lose in the way it defines winning and losing. In the case of South Africa, by contrast, the National Party has the monopoly on organized violence, but the ANC has the support of the vast majority of the population, plus international support. And you have a rough balance of power, and both sides realize this, and both sides come to believe that they can't win. They might not lose, but they can't win. Israel thinks it can win. As long as it keeps going as the situation is now, it's winning from its perspective.
Okay, so but then this perception of the potential and the power to continue, does that lie only in the understanding of the violence or the power of violence, or does economics also play a part?
Economics plays a part, especially on the side of the strong party as a power factor. It matters for the weak and the poor because they are suffering economically. And war is devastating, and what happened in Gaza is just a complete economic and humanitarian catastrophe. But for Israel, if we're talking about Israel-Palestine, its economic power gives it the confidence to keep going because it's not suffering.
So then, would something like BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, be something that can eventually draw Israel to the negotiating table, if it's activated or implemented sufficiently and correctly, perhaps?
Sufficiently is the key word, so that's why I was hesitating. You know, what worked in South Africa's case against the regime with sanctions was the arms embargo. I mean, that was the critical issue. It wasn't that we couldn't get oranges from wherever, and that, you know, there was kind of commercial products weren't getting here. I mean, so what? The arms embargo changed the military balance in the war being fought in southern Angola, such that the apartheid defense force was no longer able to protect its troops. It had lost air superiority to the Cuban MiGs. The arms embargo shifted a winning position to a potentially losing position. That unlocks the door. Now, if there were an arms embargo against the Israeli government, which there ought to be, that would absolutely change the strategic balance fundamentally. And that's why Palestinian friends of mine argue that the US is the key to unlocking Israel-Palestine.
But it shows no motivation at the moment. I mean, because, okay, let's take this to the whole roadmap for peace and the various discussions and the various peace processes, etc. In your analysis of the different peace processes, the different roadmaps, why do you see, like, what are the key holes in the strategy, and what are the main flaws in the entire mediation process to bring about peace?
The problem is that the US stands in the way. The US is not sufficiently serious about a settlement on genuinely fair terms. It is a biased mediator, and I mean, it's not even willing to talk officially to Hamas. How is it possibly, how can it be a mediator if it's not willing to talk to one of the key belligerent and political actors? It's not the right mediator. Who is the right mediator for Israel-Palestine? The right mediator is not the quartet, in my view. This is a passive, apathetic entity. I think you either want... See, I was going to say the UN, but it's not the right mediator because it's captive to the P5 and the P3 and the P1. So the UN is not, you know, it's an association of one or two states in the Middle East that are supportive of the Palestinian cause and one or two Western states that Israel could live with. I mean, Norway was well positioned for this as a, you know, benign, medium-sized power, serious about mediation. What was their interest? Their interest was peace. And it was not a bully mediation. And they never had military or economic interests that were driving them to support one side or the other. Norway, that process achieved more, although it ultimately failed, than any other process has achieved.
And what about the Arab peace process? That was, you know, put forward by the Arab League.
Look, you have to, I mean, it's axiomatic that you need all the key belligerent parties to accept the mediator. If they do, no problem. It doesn't matter who the mediator is, as long as all the parties are willing to trust the mediator.
Let me ask you a tough question. Do you think Israel is ever prepared to accept a mediator?
Well, they have to be hurting a lot more
before they will accept a mediator.
Yes, so again, I'm drawing on both general theory and my understanding of the situation there. If parties locked in that kind of long, deadly conflict, hating their opponents, if they think that they can win,
they'll continue.
They don't draw. They don't settle for a draw. I mean, that's historical record. So they have to be hurting for them to say, we want to settle this thing through negotiations, at which point they are interested in mediation. So the question is not whether they're ever interested in mediation or not. There's a prior question, I should say.
Yes.
The prior question is, can they be brought to the point at which they think that their future is imperiled?
So that they have to go for
So that they have to go to the table, that they've got to solve this thing through negotiations.
So a final question on Palestine, and then because you say that the quartet, you don't recognize the validity of the quartet, do you think the quartet is this sham just to legitimate? Yeah. So it's just a form of legitimation that Israel is really trying for peace?
Yes. You know, and a little, I mean, I think it's a fig leaf. I think it's just, it's a symbolic rhetorical exercise. That's not the only signal though. So that's an important signal. The other signal is to Western constituencies, to voters, to parliamentarians, to coalitions of civil society activists who are putting pressure on their own governments to do something. Do something about Darfur, do something about Syria, do something about Palestine. So even if they're not serious about real resolution, they need to be seen to be doing something. So
they create the quartet. And okay, and then I suppose it's the same as, for example, many liberal states who propagate this whole idea or this notion of pacifism as opposed to an active or an armed resistance. And a very good example was that they allow you to demonstrate in front of the military base or whatever to say, look, we're tolerating this alternate voice, but they know at the end of the day that this pacifism is no threat to the military per se. So in that case, for example, the quartet is a way of saying we're tolerating and we're allowing you to express different views, and look, we're doing so.
Look, anyone that's studying it closely doesn't think the quartet is doing anything and doesn't think there's any potential for the quartet.
So why the continuation of the sham?
It's a farce. It's a real farce. I'm more impressed with what the UN special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, a Russian, Ladinov. I listened to him and I'm really impressed. I mean, he's forthright, smart, clear, and he's constrained by his mandate and constrained by great powers. But he, from what I understand, is quite effective in putting out small fires that could become big fires. But if we're going to leave Palestine and move on to Syria, I want to say one thing about Palestine. I think that we also have to look at what the Palestinians are doing or not doing. And when I was there, the last time I was in Ramallah was 2007. And the Palestinians I was working with, kind of my age, most of them in the security services, Fatah, not Hamas, were deeply, deeply pessimistic to the point of defeatism. They described their struggle as having been lost permanently. Not that they were still involved in the struggle, they were having a hard time, but that the struggle was over. That they had lost, that they had suffered an irrevocable, eternal defeat. And I wanted to shake them up, and it's not my struggle. You know, if you think about our struggle here, we always knew that we were going to win. We didn't know when. We knew we were going to win because we had the power of the people on our side.
Right.
At some point, a minority of 20% could not contain a majority of 80%, so it was a matter of time. There, the power lies with their opponent, not with them. So I understand the sense of defeat, but it's too passive. And if I were them, I would be moving to declare Palestine an independent state.
Okay, let's stop there. We have to go to a break. When we come back, we're going to talk further. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to Finding Me on the ITV networks, today with Professor Laurie Nathan. And Professor Laurie Nathan is a mediator, and we're talking Syria and Palestine. So before we went into the break, you said a different strategy. Palestine should declare itself as a unilateral state. But before you give me my answer, so you said that Fatah representatives were highly despondent. And you compared it to South Africa, and you said South Africa, we had the power of the people and the vision of the people. Does that already not draw to your mind an understanding that perhaps Fatah is not representative of the people? Because if you compare the opinions of Palestinians in the West Bank and the opinions of Palestinians in Gaza, you find certainly differences, okay?
Yeah.
Older generation and younger generation also, you manifest different attitudes. That's the first thing. Secondly, declaring themselves unilaterally as a state, which is exactly what Israel did in 1948. It just declared itself a state, and everybody else in the went ahead and endorsed it. But Israel had the support because it was considered a white European state, and of course we had to make amends for the Holocaust and for what Europeans did to Europeans. Palestinians don't have that kind of leverage. They're the other. They're the black, they're the barbarian, they're Muslims, most of them are seen as that. A big problem, they do not have that kind of leverage. What's the benefit of declaring yourself unilaterally as a state?
You haven't given me any arguments about why they shouldn't, though. All you've said really is that it's going to be difficult, and it's different from Israel, of course. But the whole of the Muslim world might well be willing to recognize and support this. Maybe not all Muslim states or states with the majority of Muslim people, but many of them might be willing to do that. So they might well get recognition from at least some states that have some kind of political or religious or ethnic or cultural affinity. You may also have some of the more benign or progressive European states,
agreed,
like Norway. I mean, you want to push them hard to recognize the state. I think, thirdly, that it would not be a Fatah initiative. This would have to be put to a referendum. It would have to be Fatah and Hamas, and it would have to go to a referendum, as de Klerk, in fact, did in this country, to take the white conservative community into negotiations. So then you're speaking with the backing of the people of your country when you say we are a state, and we demand to be recognized as a state, and we will sign treaties as a state, and we will sign the Geneva Convention and protocols as a state, and we expect our combatants to be treated as war combatants in accordance with international law because we're a state.
So it's no more they are terrorists and we are the military responding to the terrorism.
Yeah. And the most important reason is pride. It's to move from a sense of hopelessness and defeat to one of we're proud to be citizens, not subjects, not oppressed. We are oppressed, but we're not just oppressed. We're not just occupied, although we are occupied. We are citizens of a state, and we want to behave like citizens of a state, and we want our state to behave like a responsible state. I think the mind shift is huge if they could achieve that.
Would they get the kind of support that would allow them to sign these treaties, etc., in the UN? You know how the UN works.
But a lot of this, as you know, is symbolic politics. So who can stop them signing it? So Israel might say, and the US might say, we don't recognize your signature, we don't recognize your flag. And the response is, well,
so
bugger you. I mean, we're signing it.
Yeah.
We're signing it, and we will behave like a state and honor our obligations.
And I think for many Palestinians, at least, that will be a sense of belonging for the first time, because you hear of so many Palestinians who want to travel, and they only have travel documents, they don't have passports. It's torturous for them, because there's no sense of belonging or ownership, and perhaps this would be a start to that belonging and ownership.
And it might be the basis for forging unity between Fatah and Hamas.
Or creating a more powerful leadership within the Palestinian territories. Let's move to Syria now. How do you see the conflict in Syria? We've had many mediators. Mediators have come and gone. What do you think?
There are, again, many, many big problems. What's distinctive from a mediator's perspective about Syria is two things stand out in particular. The first is the fact that you have the most powerful countries, the two most powerful countries in the world, opposing each other actively, not just passively, but actively backing other sides. Now, as long as you have that, it's hard to see any kind of resolution. That perspective was Kofi Annan's perspective, and is the reason that he resigned as the first UN mediator. He said, my own principles are disunited, and so my authority and leverage are fatally compromised. And then Ban Ki-moon offered the job to Lakhdar Brahimi, and Brahimi apparently said, I don't want this. This is not ripe for resolution. And Ban Ki-moon prevailed on Brahimi, and Brahimi said, okay, but my first and most important challenge is to mediate between the US and Russia. If I can turn that around, then I move down to the regional level. So from a mediator's perspective, sometimes, like South Sudan, you'd want to work simultaneously at the national, local, and regional levels. But other times, and I think Syria is an example, and I've heard many senior UN mediators say this, you have to work sequentially from the top down. So you have to sort out the global, then you move to the regional, and then you move to the national. But you can't deal with the national
without going there.
So that's your one big problem. Now that could change, of course, because regimes, administrations come and go, costs and benefits change in the calculations of the parties. The US and the Russian positions are not fixed in stone.
Yes, especially not in Syria. Yeah.
And it's not their own survival at stake. So there is the potential for forging some kind of closer position. Second huge problem is the fragmentation amongst the opposition, which is a mediator's nightmare. So I'm giving you a mediator's perspective. Obviously, we want fewer rather than more parties. The fewer the parties, the easier it is to get consensus. The
and
more
so
parties,
many different ideologies also that are coming to the table.
Yep. And when I was involved with the African Union and then the UN mediation for Darfur, we never had nearly as many splinter groups, but still, we had the problem of fragmentation where the other side, the regime, Khartoum, was saying to us, who do we, saying privately to the mediators, who do you expect us to mediate with? They are so disunited, they can't speak with one voice. They keep overthrowing their leaders. Their leaders have no real, whatever their popular appeal, they don't have real command and control. So you are saying to us, mediators, to Khartoum, sit at the table and negotiate seriously, but with whom? We don't have a viable negotiating partner, opponent. It's a real problem when you have fragmentation. It happens in other conflicts, and the research doesn't indicate any obvious or general solution to the problem.
Right.
Sometimes mediators have tried to unify fragmented groups, largely unsuccessfully. You need much more political actors than mediators to try and unify fragmented groups. So if you want to unify groups in Syria, it's not the mediator that can do that. It's not Lakhdar Brahimi or Kofi Annan or de Mistura.
We're almost at the end, and I just want to throw in one more spoke into your will. But now we have one more contending actor, that is IS. What do you think, from a mediating perspective, should IS be brought to the table? Can you mediate with IS in terms of, as one of the factions that's fighting within that particular area and in that particular conflict? How does the UN mediators, or even those who are seeking peace, tie all of these things together to try and resolve? Say, for instance, Turkey manages to leverage Russia now. Back down. The US has something going there that also part of the NATO agreement, they back down. So now we're mediating the local area, the local conflict.
Yeah. The mediator's response is we never stand on principle. In other words, we would never exclude a party on grounds of principle. The principle is inclusivity.
Everybody.
Everybody.
Across the board.
Across the board.
Right, okay.
Because our commitment is to peace and security. And pragmatically, politically, you don't get that if you leave out people with guns. So there's a clear normative orientation that peacemakers or mediators have. We want the bad guys and the good guys, however you define them or I define them or they define each other.
And everybody has different perspectives.
I want everybody in the room. I do, especially with power. The problem is, from a mediator's perspective, do I want all these hundreds of groups that don't have power? They complicate my life. And they're citizens, so of course they have to be taken seriously. But I am very serious about those with power. Now, that's different from groups that choose to exclude themselves. So if any group says, doesn't matter whether it's religious or ideological or whatever, if they say our position is non-negotiable, therefore we won't come into negotiations, my response is, in general, you can't win this thing. You can't win this thing. So you can keep going for as long as you like.
You're just going to have more dead bodies.
At some point, how do wars end? You know, this kind of war. Islamic State's not going to win.
No, it's not going to win.
So negotiations is the way we have. Then let's assume, now I don't know if they're at all receptive to negotiations, but I have colleagues who know the situation in Nigeria very well and do not hold the position that it's impossible to negotiate with Boko Haram. They say there have in fact been successful negotiations. But one of the problems that you're going to encounter if you do enter into negotiations with hardline groups, whoever they are, whether religious or ideological, is that they may have certain demands or positions that they perceive to be non-negotiable, that the rest of you think are absolutely unacceptable and intolerable. And there's no general answer. This is the crux, the heat of negotiation, that you've got to try and solve this thing to everyone's satisfaction.
And is there always a way, a last comment, a window out to solve the situation?
When we look to the future, the answer seems to be no. When we look back historically, the answer is yes.
And yesterday you said mediators are not justice activists or democracy activists, but you're a peace activist.
Yes.
So ultimately it's about peace.
Yes, and it's not like we're opposed to democracy. I think, you know, I mean, I was involved in the struggle here as an activist against apartheid. So as a mediator, I would say there should be democracy activists, there should be justice activists, there should be human rights activists. Raise your voices. I'm not telling you to shut up. I'm saying wage a good fight here. But my job as the mediator is to try and forge a peace.
And hopefully with that there will be justice.
Yes, for normative ethical reasons, but also for pragmatic reasons, because if there's no justice in our settlement, then one day those that feel that they were not done justice come back to fight again, to fight another day. But I also think that we're going to compromise justice to some extent. We did in this country. And I think it was a compromise we had to make.
But it looks like it's coming back to bite us.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting to see the unraveling.
Yes.
Yeah.
So ultimately, as they say, no justice, no peace. With that, thank you very much, Laurie. Thank you for sharing your insights. في أمان الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
قسما بالله رب العالمين وارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم